If we're thinking about how rulers are trying to really create a theatrical, right, version of themselves, then we should look no further than Ashurbanipal. So again, we've moved forward, right, in Mesopotamian history, in Near Eastern history, and now we are hanging out with the Assyrians, right? So we're getting towards the end of the Mesopotamian time frame here. And Ashurbanipal is famous for building this elaborate palace. One thing I wanted to bring up while discussing Ashurbanipal's name was that sometimes if you're looking at different sources, you may see slightly different spellings of names. Like Shumash, for instance, is often spelled Shamash with an A, not a U. And Ashurbanipal, you may also see it spelled differently. This is really nothing to be very concerned about because as I mentioned, cuneiform was a pictographic language that we then had to translate into basically a phonetic language like English. So you'll often see where people sort of disagree slightly on spellings. This will also happen with hieroglyphs because Egyptians really didn't have the idea of phonograms of like vowels as we know them. So the idea of again of using a vowel is sort of you have to just substitute in the vowel that you want. This is why you see Shumash, Shamash, because again, it doesn't really matter. So again, just something to note if you're seeing different versions of these names and you're like, well, is she spelling them wrong? No, that's really not what it is. It's, again, there's different ways that people spell them and disagreement on which one is actually the best. So sometimes we just default back to the one that we learned when we learned it. And for me, it's Ashurbanipal. Shumash is how I learned that god's name. So again, I default to more of those spellings. So again, just an interesting aside about linguistics. I've shown you here with this tile, basically, two reconstructions. So if you look at the top left and the bottom right, you're looking at reconstruction. So, our interpretations of what we think the palace looked like. And then bottom left, top right, you're seeing the actual carvings from the palace. Ashurbanipal wanted to create a place where when people came to visit him, they'd be overwhelmed, right, with what they were seeing. And the imagery that he places inside is related to his great victories, right? And also a celebration of who he thinks he is as a person, essentially. So when we look at some of these carvings, we know that he's really kind of celebrating his power over the people around him. So some of the carvings deal with the Battle of Tiltuba. I gave you a nice video on this, so make sure you watch that. And some other the carvings deal with lion hunts, which we'll get to in a minute. Now, why include these things? If you're a visitor, these are going to be pretty overwhelming images. Like, you try to go against me, I'm going to kill you, right? Which is what they did with the people of, Elam, the Elamites, essentially. And so you see them yoked on the ground, about to be basically decapitated. In some of the images, it shows them planting crops right on the dead, essentially. Also, you'll note his lion hunting reliefs, right, where you see Ashurbanipal hunting these lions. Now, I think it's interesting to note with these lion hunting reliefs a very important thing, which is that notice how far they've moved away from the reverence of nature to the point where they kill nature as a theatrical showpiece. Prehistoric people would be pretty appalled by this. They'd be like, "You kill animals because you want to eat them, and you worship them in a sense because of that. You don't kill them for show. You don't kill them for theater." So the relationship to animals is very removed to what it was in the prehistoric. If you look at this, and again, it makes Ashurbanipal kind of look like a peacock, like he's showing off, in order to justify his rulership in some ways. So again, we have to think about the type of imagery these rulers are creating. And I think we, this kind of attitude is very far removed from Naram Sin's attitude of like have some respect in a sense. I also want to mention that these carvings would have been painted originally. So the way that we look at them today is very limited. We think they were meant to be almost like movies, moving images as you move through the space. You were looking at these narratives unfurl in front of you, that they were supposed to have almost like a cinematic effect. And I also want to mention the kind of carving you're seeing here, which is what we call relief carving. Very different than sculpture in the round or 3D carving. Relief carving is attached to a backing stone. It's never freed from that stone. So you'll notice that the image of the lion here, there's a backing stone and it's carved out of that essentially. Relief to me comes from the idea of relieving the stone of its mass. You're taking mass away to make the image emerge. You're relieving that mass from the stone. So it's relief carving. You can have relief carving that's very low relief, as we say. This is very low relief, and then you can have very high relief. So as we go along through the course, I'll show you some examples of more low relief carvings, and then I'll also show you some high relief as well. But notice this is a very different sculptural technique from 3D or in the round sculptural carving. And again, thinking about Ashurbanipal and this idea of him being kind of a peacock, let's say, notice that he has kind of the backup of the servant who's already shot the lion in the head, but he allows Ashurbanipal to go in for the final kill. So the sense of this being kind of a circus like idea more so than something that's about his own peril or him really going out and fighting this lion and killing it. I also stress the fact that lions are exotic creatures that would have had to have been brought into the Near Eastern region. So it shows that power and control of having to import an animal just to kill it. And then if you look at the hierarchy of scale, notice that basically Ashurbanipal is taller than all of them. So if we're thinking a little bit about the rendering and the use of the scale, it's again being used here also. The final group I wanted to show you is the Persians. The Persians are the conclusion of the Near Eastern groups, the subgroups, and they, of course, are famous for the leaders Darius and Xerxes, who openly called themselves the kings of the universe. So these guys had no illusions about, you know, the pomposity of what they were saying, and they were sort of making themselves into spectacular, like otherworldly, almost godlike, if you think about it, rulers. So again, a huge divergence from Naram Sin's attitude about who he was as the ruler and how he should have some reverent respect. And these guys are like, well, we're just kings of the universe, so get out of our way. When we look at the Persians, the best place to go to is the palace at Persepolis. And again, looking back, you can see some reconstruction drawings of what we think the Palace of Persepolis would have looked like in its heyday. Notice that most of these places were heavily painted originally. So what we see when we look at these ruins is really not a great representation of what they really looked like. And we're looking at the audience hall imagery, where you see these people coming to give offerings, right, to the kings. You also see some lion imagery here as well. We think that that was influenced by Ashurbanipal's imagery that had come before. And then we can see, of course, the large audience hall that had existed here with these 60-foot high columns. It would have been, of course, a very magnificent, impressive space. It still is today, even in its ruined state. So this was a place for people to come and give honor and give, offering essentially to the rulers. So again, they almost take on like a godlike kind of status because of the fact of people coming to this place and giving them duty basically. So I would show you these two pieces kind of more close up and discuss them a little bit more deeply. Where Darius, in the image at the left, has progressed from fighting a lion to fighting a monster. So, I mean, a lion isn't even good enough anymore. You have to be almost mythologically, special where you could fight a monster. So there's that. And then on the right, you have a nice close up of these people from all around the Persian Empire coming to give duty. I gave you a nice video on Persepolis that gets a little bit closer in on the idea of the various people of the Persian Empire, where they were from, and the kind of things they would bring. Like Ethiopians would have brought like camels, for instance. What I love about this image is it shows you a little bit about how you'd show unity if you wanted to show unity as a ruler. Notice that some of the people are holding hands to show a unified kind of idea of these different areas of the Persian Empire being unified. That's actually still very common in Middle Eastern cultures for friends to hold hands. So even friends of the same sex, when men go walking down the street, they often hold hands, and it's not like a romantic gesture; it's a friendship gesture, and it derives from, again, as far back as the Persian Empire. And the Persians, by the way, they fall as an empire, but culturally they still exist as people. So again, you can meet people and they'll say, "I'm Persian," because again, they derive from this empire essentially as far as their background. So again, just a note on the sort of idea of unity there. And I love that they're interacting with each other. You get a sense of the artist wanting to do a symbolic look to the people, because notice they look very similar to what you'll see later in Egypt. So we'll talk about that, how the Egyptian look isn't really singular to Egypt. It's just a very stylized symbolic look. You know, the Egyptians will make it into a canon or a group of rules. We don't have that information about whether the Near Eastern people were doing that. But again, there's a similarity in this kind of rigidness of pose and symbolicness of pose. But I love how the one guy almost is turning backwards, like, "Hey, what did you bring? Oh man, we said there was a $20 limit." You know, if you've ever done gift exchange, right? You're making me look bad, right? You brought gold, I brought like myrrh over here. So um, I like that they're sort of interacting with each other, and that gives a sense of reality, right, to them. And then here, I always show you Darius on his throne, both the real image where you see it was defaced, and then kind of a reconstruction that lets you see it a little bit better without the defacement. Um, the Persians, by the way, were overthrown by the Greeks. So when we get to talking about the Greeks, I'll remind you of this. I'll say, think about the fact that, the Persians, later are dethroned when the Greeks come back and overthrow them. The Persians will go and attack the Greeks, so they will raise their ire, and the Persians will be defeated by them under Alexander the Great. So, we talk about these cultures kind of in a box sometimes in modules, right? But you have to understand that often the timelines overlap, interact with each other. So even though we talk about the Greeks later, they will be the ones to bring down the Persian Empire. And that's who defaced the monument, essentially, right? I also show you this to give you a sense of how people would act in front of these godlike rulers now, these kings of the universe. So notice that Darius is having an audience, and this person has come before them, and they're sort of bowing slightly and putting their hand to their mouth. And what we think that was meant to suggest is like, you are the king, you speak, I do not. So there's a sense of how you would act in proximity, right, to the king, that you would not feel that you had the right to speak. So, gods of the universe, right, indeed. Hopefully, you can see again how rulership changes and progresses as you move along, right, through the Near Eastern culture, and how you kind of hit the high point here at the conclusion with the Persians.